Welcome to the For Love and Money podcast, the show where business and social purpose meet to inspire a movement for positive change. Here's your host, Carolyn Butler-Madden.
Hi folks. Before we begin, I want to share something personal. When I first picked up Peter Baines' latest book, Together We Can, I didn't anticipate just how much it would move me. So the book is the story behind an extraordinary feat. On 1st of December 2024, at the age of 57, Peter Baines set off in the extreme heat and humidity from the north of Thailand to run 1,400 kilometres in just 26 days, averaging 60 kilometres per day. This was to honour the 20th anniversary of the Boxing Day tsunami and to raise funds for it. Now, that's an extraordinary feat. And on one level, the idea of the run itself is incredible. Running that distance in that time is, frankly, it's bonkers. Okay, that alone is enough to stop you in your tracks. But what really struck me wasn't just what Peter did, it was why he did it. It was who he did it for. And just as importantly, it was how it was done, together. This book isn't really about endurance or physical limits. It's about collective effort. It's about the power of community. And it's about what becomes possible when people come together around a shared purpose, each playing their part, each carrying one another through moments that feel impossibly hard. And that theme, Together We Can, the title of the book, sits at the very heart of today's conversation. My guest is Peter Baines OAM, leadership expert, humanitarian, powerful storyteller, and as many describe him, an everyday hero. Peter's path to this work is anything but conventional. He spent 2 decades as a forensic investigator with the New South Wales Police, working in major crime, disaster victim identification, and international counter-terrorism with Interpol and the United Nations. But it was his work in Thailand following the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami that changed everything. Moved by the needs of children left without families or homes, Peter founded Hands Across the Water, an organisation that, nearly 20 years on, has raised well over $40 million and transformed the lives of hundreds of young people through long-term care, education and opportunity. As I said, in 2024, to mark the 20th anniversary of the tsunami, Peter undertook the Run to Remember, the journey that inspired Together We Can. And in this episode, we talk about what that experience revealed, not just about resilience and leadership, but about presence, belief, shared responsibility, and the weather we bring as leaders. This is a conversation about doing hard things and why they matter. It's about leadership without ego, and it's about the quiet, powerful truth that none of the big things we achieve are ever done alone. I'm so grateful to share this conversation with you. Let's begin. Peter, welcome to the For Love and Money podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's delightful to join you.
I'm so excited to get into this conversation. I've just finished reading your latest book, Together We Can, and it's extraordinary, and we will get into it. But before we do, I'd like to kick off with the signature question of this podcast, which is, do you believe there's a role for love in business?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I've spent the last 20 years of my professional life, building a charity, and which became Australia's largest contributing charity to Thailand. And I talk about the first 20 years of my professional life was in some way dealing with the worst of humanity as a member of the New South Wales Police involved in major crime investigations through my work within the Forensic Services Group. I saw the absolute worst of people. And I think the last 20 years has shown me the absolute best of humanity. So absolutely, I'm a firm believer in love in business and doing something for others. And is, I think there's a real business message behind that, is when we do something for someone else without expectation, often we benefit.
And I guess what you're saying, it extends to leadership, doesn't it?
Yeah. Like, I think I talk at conferences about leadership, and I think if there was one key message that I was asked to share, which I think is the most important, and I've seen it through a number of my international deployments, through Japan and through Bali and Thailand, and it's not just related to crisis and disaster, but I think the most important thing for leaders is to be present. And I think it demonstrates that we care and we understand the challenges. And I think we can look at examples where leaders have been absent and how that's played out, and equally when they're present and what that means and what that says about their care for those that they lead and the communities they're trying to build.
Yeah. And there's often real courage in being present in difficult moments, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I certainly talk about is that there's no expectation or there's no requirement for leaders to have all of the answers or to necessarily bring about change instantly. And but when we're present, it says we care and it says we understand. I don't think the courage is necessarily turning up. I think it's just a self-awareness. And I think a lot of leaders underestimate the importance of their presence. And, too many leaders will just underestimate the significance of that. And, we look at crisis and disaster and of course, it's only a couple of days now since the horrors and the atrocities of what occurred in Bondi. And if we look at those that have been on the forefront, our leaders with our Prime Minister, our Premier, our Police Commissioner, and change will take time.
Yeah.
Legislative change will take time, and it needs to take time. It needs to be considered. And I would suggest that none of those that I've talked about right now have all of the answers. And, it's such a difficult thing to prevent when there's a lone actor undertaking this type of thing. But by them being present, it gives reassurance and comfort to the community who are watching on from their television screens or those affected that our leaders are there. And I don't know that it takes courage to do that. I think that's just your job.
Thank you. Thank you. I want our listeners to learn a little bit about you. So you've had an extraordinary and quite an unconventional career. Policing, disaster victim identification, leadership consulting, and humanitarian work. And I read in the book, didn't you start a law degree as well?
Started and finished, so I was happy about that.
Yeah. Started and finished. There is a theme there that comes through. Can you share with our listeners the key moments that shaped who you are today?
Well, I think, I guess a bit of background to answer that question is that, as you suggested, first part of my career was with New South Wales Police, and very quickly moved, after 4 years or so in uniform, I moved into the forensic area. And as I say, if a week went past where I wasn't involved in the investigation of death, it was an unusual week. And that could have been suicide, suspicious death, could have been homicide, all major crime. That was our job. And I spent 10 years in Tamworth in New South Wales, and then returned to Sydney. And I returned not long after 9/11 and the impact of that. And then my time in Sydney back as a detective inspector looking after the state operations of the Forensic Services Group meant that when Bali happened, I would deploy into Bali as part of the Australian contingent involved in the investigation of the crime. But my role more specific was as part of the disaster victim identification. And the work we did there positioned us for, I guess, one of those that would be called upon early if something else happened in Southeast Asia. And that was certainly the case with the Boxing Day tsunami, where there'd be 250,000 people who would lose their lives. And in Thailand, we recovered 5,395 bodies. And I led the international operation at different times in the identification and repatriation of those. And that took most of 2005. And then the final couple of years of my time within the police before I resigned was working on a highly classified counter-terrorism project for Interpol, and based upon what we call CBRN, which is chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. And then I spent the last 12 months or so on secondment with the UN Office of Drug and Crime. And so when we talk about pivotal points, I think Bali was probably the most significant, because it then positioned me within the Australian leadership group of forensic practitioners. And
can we just, so for listeners outside of Australia and Asia, perhaps, you're referring to the 2002 Bali terrorist bombings?
Yeah, correct. The bombings that claimed 202 lives, 88 Australians, and the bombings in Paddy's Bar and the Sari Club, and I think that when we talk about significant junctures in my career, that was the one that then it was a sliding door moment where it then took me into Thailand, and then things would change from there. Where as I said, I went on and did the counter-terrorism work. I'd then be invited into Japan after the tsunami there. I worked as a consultant with the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in relation to floods and disasters over there, and capacity building and reviewing their disaster response. And I think none of those things are likely to have occurred if not for Bali. And then, the other obvious point for me was meeting a group of children who had lost their families in the aftermath of the tsunami. They were living in a tent, and that meeting with them and the desire to try to bring about some change for them set me on a path that, as you say, is unconventional.
And that's the turning point. And as you talk about your past and your careers, and you talked earlier about seeing the worst of humanity in the beginning of your career. How do you mentally deal with that? Like one event after another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the role that I performed within the forensic services group, within the police, there were 4 different areas that were considered high risk for post-traumatic stress and so forth. And our area was one of them. And to answer your question, how do you deal with it? Well, there is no blueprint, because if there was, we wouldn't lose many of our staff to PTSD. And PTSD is a pretty horrible thing. It's not something that you overcome and put in the past. It's something you have to manage for your life. And many mates that I went through uni with who remain medicated today, 20 years on from the work that they did. And I don't know, honestly, why I managed to have a career with exposure of the things that I did and come out of it without any clinical depression or anything like that. I feel like there's probably a few things, and one of them was that the nature of my work continued to evolve. And so I went from a practitioner to a team leader to, state operations coordinator, to then these international deployments, then to Interpol. And so I wasn't stuck in the one role. And I think if I look at it, and I've thought about this a lot, I think those that struggled were the ones who were in the role, but looking forward, they had another 10 or 15 years before they could retire. And where my role, just through different reasons, just kept changing. And so I wasn't stuck in that grind and what can be a depressive state without any, hope or suggestion that change would come.
So you were moving forward, it was propelling you from one place to the next, and then
Yeah, and it certainly didn't mean that then the exposure stopped, because
no.
arriving into Thailand, I walked into a temple where there was 3,500 decomposing bodies on the ground, and no one has seen that before.
Mm.
That on a global scale, no one had that experience and that exposure to what we were confronted with. And they were, for the vast majority of those bodies, they were in an advanced state of decomposition. So it wasn't that, that movement through my career took me away from that exposure. My role just changed.
And then you said you met the children in Thailand. What happened then?
Yeah, so it was on one of my last deployments into Thailand, and it was late in 2005, and just visited a group of kids who were living in a temple in a tent. There was a temporary structure. A lady from Bangkok had come down to look after these kids, and these kids were all Thai and had lost their families to the tsunami, and lost their parents, their homes, many of their brothers and sisters, and I realised I couldn't change what had happened, but it felt within my capacity to change what happened next. And so with a colleague from the UK, we made a decision that we would, see if we could raise some money and change the way these kids spent each night. And that was the start of Hands Across the Water, which I thought would begin and end with the opening of the home for the kids. But it was only when I went over there and for the opening of the first home in 2006 that I realised the journey had just begun, and it was anything but over. And here we are, having celebrated 20 years in October of this year. Our commitment is bigger and broader than ever before.
And haven't you raised $40 million? I can't even imagine the impact that has had.
Yeah, we have. It's beyond that now. We've had 56 kids from across the different properties or homes we look after who have graduated from university. And the important thing there is it gives them a life of choice. We've got kids living in different parts of the world who have left Thailand because they have no longer an attachment to Thailand. We've got one of our first students has completed his PhD. We've got kids heading off to uni every year. But equally, our investment is not just in those going to university, but those for whom university is not a choice, either theirs or for different reasons. And we know that wherever you live, university is not the answer for everyone. And so a big part of our work in 2026 for the next 5 years is creating these commercial operations that will see the charity self-sufficient but importantly, create learning and education and employment opportunities for the kids through hospitality, through tourism, the agriculture centre that we're building. So, that measure of our success when we look at and the charity sector is interesting because you look at business, and every one of your listeners who is in business, growth is a measure of success. But for charity, the ultimate measure of success is to cease to exist. And you think about your favourite charity, or your listeners think about their favourite charity, whether it's in medical research, cancer research, homelessness, or, if the charity said we've got no more work to do and close their doors, that's ultimately success. So for us, growth is not success. It's just a sign of a bigger problem. And so how do we work towards our ultimate aim? Well, it's through education, employment, and creating this brighter future and a choice for the kids when it comes time to leave our home.
That's amazing, Peter. Like you write about it in your book, Together We Can, a little bit about the commercial enterprise that sits behind the bike rides. Can you talk a little bit more about that to explain how it works to our listeners? And I guess that model is then being replicated through the tourism and agricultural social enterprises you're now looking at rolling out.
Yeah, absolutely. And It's, I guess I came to this sector within not-for-profit sector without any experience. It wasn't something that I was involved in. It was, and like a lot of founders, they're touched by something, whether it's personal tragedy, it's family tragedy, or mine was the exposure to Thailand. And I set up a charity, and the idea was to raise money for build a home. And as I said, I thought my job was done, but I realised it had just begun. And because I was still working full time in the police. Through personal circumstances, I was in a pretty horrible place in my life, and we were able to raise money for a very short time on people's connection to the tsunami. But I remember we were only a couple of years in and raising money, and I had someone say to me, "You're still raising money for those kids."
Wow.
And it's a sign of
How quickly we move on.
Oh, absolutely. And I've seen it in all of the different crisis areas I've worked in internationally. Large organizations, there'll be charities, there'll be corporate, there'll be government, there'll be NGOs who turn up, put their flag on the ground and say, "We're here." But too many leave too quickly because those who have lost their families, they don't recover, they don't move on when we move on. When it stops being relevant, when it's been replaced on TV by something else, doesn't mean their problems have gone away.
Yeah.
The parents of the kids who we support, they never come back. And so for us, it was I needed to find a way that the work we were doing in supporting the kids was relevant. Now, there's 64,000 charities in Australia. And so it's a hugely competitive space. And how you become relevant is, in my mind, it's for us, the model has been what we offer our communities and our supporters. And so from very early on, we developed a business model, and it's actually what my second book is about, which is called Doing Good by Doing Good. And it's how you turn corporate social responsibility from a cost center to a profit center. Because whether it's a family, individual, or business, when times get a bit tight, we look at our discretionary spend, and support of charity is often the first to go. But what happens is when those times get hard, that's when people lean into charity for support. So the supply goes down and the demand goes up. And basic economics tells you that can't exist. So the work that I did and the writing of the second book was around, well, how do we turn philanthropy from a cost center to a profit center? And when we think about it from a business perspective, it's brand differentiation, it's customer attraction, it's staff retention, it's new markets, and all of this you can do through, a well-developed CSR program, because a lot of people see CSR as philanthropy, and they're different. And so with that mindset, we've always at Hands started from the place of how do we return value first and foremost to those who want to support us. And you mentioned these bike rides, and it started in 2009, but for the exception of COVID, we're now delivering 6 or 7 of these rides a year. And, our latest ride that we opened 2 weeks ago, 2 months earlier than normal for January 2027, we opened it on the Wednesday afternoon because it was a video release at the time. And by Thursday morning, it was sold out.
Oh, wow.
And we couldn't shut the site down quick enough, and we ended up with 8 more registrations than we wanted. And now we've set up a second ride in January. But the thing is, people who come, and we've got in that ride, and I don't know whether the jury's out whether it's a good or bad thing, that 80% of those who are riding are return riders. And so we're not bringing in new supporters, new markets, new support base and so forth. But gee, it's good to have that type of return client and supporter. And if you ask them why they come back and ride, there'll be a number of things. And the first is what they get out of it. It's the community that they have. It's that shared experience. It's that time to do something for themselves. It's this journey which is food for your soul. And that's what we create. but to be part of it, you have to raise money. And then that's how we support the kids. So we've got, we do one public ride a year, and then we deliver 5 or 6 business corporate rides throughout the year, because people want to be closer to those that they want to do business with. And you don't achieve that by networking drinks or something like that. It's this 5 days on the bike, which, makes people laugh, makes people cry. It builds these relationships and bonds that last forever. And this is the model that we've taken all through the charity, is how do we return value to someone first and foremost, and that brings the communities in. And then, as I said, we've got these projects within the next 5 years that are commercial operations through our social enterprise that will deliver the funding for our charity, in addition to creating employment and education. And so it's just having to do things differently, because if I was just trying to raise money on people feeling sad, sorry, or guilty, we would never be able to exist. And it's never a place that we've gone to, and never a place that I will go to, because our story is a positive one. It's not one of showing sick kids and things like that.
Enjoying the podcast? If you're looking for more inspiration, head to our website, thecauseeffect.com.au, for more resources on how you can start using your business as a force for good. Or buy the For Love and Money book. Every copy sold allows us to protect 1 square metre of rainforest.
And it's interesting. You said a lot of business people or leaders see CSR as philanthropy. I think a lot of them also think of their CSR or ESG work streams as, oh, that's our purpose work, which drives me insane. It's like, how can you abuse this word purpose? Like, how can you misunderstand it? And what I love is, this idea, if you think of a line, a continuum, and business, for-profit of business is on one side, for-purpose charities is on the other, but in the middle, there is this space where, it's becoming occupied by businesses who want everything they do to contribute to a higher purpose, not just the little side projects. And charities, there are some charities like yours who are moving into that space as well. And, I think there's a definition, I've spoken about it before. Professor Colin Mayer he's an emeritus professor at Oxford Uni's Business School. And he defines the purpose of business is to create profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, not to profit by creating problems. And that's that space, isn't it? And
that's I wrote a lot about that as shared value in my book, and that whole continuum of engaging the supply chain, and when that becomes a focus, there is so many commercial benefits there that allow you to capitalize on those opportunities and make profit. And making profit's not a bad thing, because
absolutely,
as you said, that's where the support for that third sector almost exists.
Absolutely. And profit allows you to scale your impact and be sustainable with your impact.
Right.
Let's talk about your book, Together We Can. Congratulations, Peter.
Thank you.
A beautiful book. It's extraordinary on so many levels. I said to you earlier, it brought me to tears a couple of times. It documents the Run to Remember in 2024 to mark the 20th anniversary of the Boxing Day tsunami. You set out to run 1,400 kilometres in 26 days. That's an average of 60 Ks a day, which is an ultra marathon a day. I mean, it's mind-blowing, but the extraordinariness of this wasn't just the scale and the craziness of the undertaking itself. It wasn't just your mental strength, which I can't imagine the strength when you share what happened in the lead up and during the run and things like that. That mental strength is extraordinary. But most of all, what really got me was the concept behind the book, Together We Can. You know, those you did it for, the people who joined you, and what you achieved together, and how you did it together. And I just think there's so much we can take from your experience. And I really want people to read your book.
Thank you.
So can you tell our listeners the story behind the book and what you want people to understand from it?
Yeah, gee, that brings up some emotions, that because it's 12...
I should have had that background music, Rise Up. I was thinking,
yeah, isn't
how
that
do I
beautiful?
bring that in?
Yeah, it's 12 months ago today. We were on the road and we were running, and I grieve it. I miss it every day. And so I guess to take a step back, as we approached the 20-year anniversary of the tsunami, I knew I wanted to do something significant. And I've already spoken about the bike rides, and I can ride a long way and have done that. And that was never going to be something worthy of the 20-year anniversary. And I've been doing that for, since 2009. I've ridden these, distances of 800 kilometers at a time on 43 different occasions in Thailand. So doing it again was never going to be special. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I came up with this concept in September of 2022, and I kept it to myself for a number of weeks. And I thought, when I put this out there, then it becomes real. And so I wanted to make sure that I'd had time to think about it. I looked on Google Maps as to a start and finish point and a distance, and was it achievable? And all of this comes from the point of I wasn't a runner. And I'd run one road marathon in my life previously and didn't enjoy it. And that was part of the attraction, was to do something where success was certainly not guaranteed. And so I thought about it for several weeks, and then this morning I walked out to my wife, and who happens to be the CEO of the commercial activities of Hands, so has a very vested interest in what we do through Hands, let alone what we do as a family. And I said to her, I'm thinking about this run from Ban Home Hug, which is our HIV home that we support in the northeast, down to Bantham Nam Chai, which is a tsunami project. And I think about running it. And her response was, defining. It was either, if she'd shut it down, it wouldn't have, taken another breath as a concept. But her response was, well, I believe in you. And that's all we need. We just need one person to believe in us through the good times and equally through the bad times. And so it became real that morning that she said, I believe in you. We talked about fundraising limits, and then I set out. I started training 12 months after I'd made the decision, and it was September 2023 when I first started training for it, and launched it 12 months out. And when I first started looking at it, was 1,300 kilometers, which is the if you put into Google, it's how you get from point A to point B. But, I could never run that route given the main roads and all the rest. And so then as I, developed the route and spent hours and hours poring over mapping software, I found this route that turned out to be 1,411 kilometers. And I'd set it over 25 days. I wanted to start on the 1st of December, and it was non-negotiable. I had to finish on Boxing Day, and because that was the anniversary of the tsunami. And so I did it over 25 days so I could have a day up my sleeve if I needed to, because I just had no idea how this was going to do it. Like, I'd never run successive days before, and so I had no idea what my body would be like, what the whole thing would be like. And so the planning went ahead, and a couple of weeks prior to the 1st of December, I was leading a leadership program for an Australian client in Thailand, and it was the end of October, and I walked into a tree that had been cut off below knee level, and it hurt, but I didn't think it was anything significant. But it turned into, within the next week, this raging infection that meant I ended up in hospital on an IV and being treated with these antibiotics. And then, the doctor who was treating me said, I think the infection has gone into the bone. And he said, I don't know you appreciate the significance of that, but you won't be going to Thailand. The run will be off. You'll have a PICC line put into a vein, which needs to be changed every day for between 8 and 12 weeks. And this was less than 4 weeks out from the run that I'd been planning for 2 years and training for over 12 months. We had over $300,000 already raised towards our goal of $1 million. And here I've got this doctor telling me that the run would be off. And I was out at a regional hospital when this occurred near our farm, and I wanted to get back closer to our home on the coast and asked for a transfer, and he released me from hospital and said, you need to get these prescriptions filled. But what he did was he actually made a mistake in the medication he gave me, and instead of giving me an antibiotic, which would have put me on 3 antibiotics, he gave me high blood pressure medication. And because of the training that I had done and where I was at, my resting heart rate sits in the mid to low 40s, and it's just a sign of where I was from a training point of view. And then he's given me this high blood pressure medication, which had the effect of dropping my heart rate even more. And instead of giving me, and if you're on this high blood pressure medication, you should take 50 milligrams per 24 hours. He'd prescribed me 100 milligrams 3 times a day. So I was taking 6 times the dose of someone with high blood pressure. And it was only by chance that my daughter-in-law, who's a wound specialist, queried what medication I'd been put on. And when I told her, she said, no, you've made a mistake. You wouldn't be on that. And I went to the hospital on the central coast of New South Wales where I live, and they said, no, you're not on that medication. And I produced the discharge notes. They said, no, you wouldn't be on that. And then I produced the actual drugs. And then they realised what had happened. And, there was an inquiry within the hospital because of what happened. And the inquiry, I would hear from the medical director of the hospital who said that, if I'd taken the drugs for one more night, I wouldn't have woken up. I would have gone into heart failure. And so the lead up to the run was, one, I had this infection in my leg, which wouldn't heal. And then I'd been, I had this very, and not to make it dramatic, but I'd had this near-death experience, and where, on the medical opinion was, if I'd taken these drugs for one more night, my heart rate was dropping down into the 20s. And so it meant for the month of December, I couldn't train, because each time I thought I could go out and run, this wound on my leg hadn't healed and it was breaking open. And the last thing I wanted to do was to arrive into Thailand with an open wound on my leg. I thought that's just going to invite more problems. So to start on the 1st of December, I wasn't at my peak, let's say. I'd lost a month of training, and it just, it meant that, and in some way, because it was over 26 days, it was okay, because it meant that I then had the first several days to recover, to build back up and regain the fitness, that was there, but had been lost in the month. And, my coach who saw me through all of this, he said, most people who start these big endurance events pull out within 3 days. And day 2 would be the longest day I'd have on the road from a time perspective. I started in the dark in the morning and I finished in the dark. And that just shouldn't happen. It's only 60 kilometres a day.
Only 60 kilometres a day. Sorry. To us normal folk,
I just mean from a time perspective, It shouldn't take you that long.
Yeah.
And it had a big impact, but I just had to be patient. I just had to believe that if I just persisted, that I would get that fitness back. And when it came back, it was, probably 10 days in or so forth, we were finishing 2 to 3 hours earlier than what we had on day 2.
But
And
just go back a minute. To sustain that injury and to go through that experience of the being given the wrong medication, coming close to a near-death experience, did you consider not doing it?
no, it just wasn't an option for me because, and this is one of the things that drove me, so hard through it. And day 14 on the run was the most defining day. And when I left the hospital at Lithgow with the news that the run was off, I went and sat in the car in the parking lot and cried. I went, how can this fall apart because of something so innocuous? And so when I just went, I can't put this off. How do you say within weeks of flying over, I'm not going to do it? And because I got an infection on my leg, and I guess if it had gone into the bone, and then I wouldn't have had the choice, but it wasn't as severe as he thought, and with it hadn't been in the bone, and there was just so many people that believed in me, that were supporting me. Like I had a crew of 10 people, half of whom had travelled from Australia to be part of this, to support my goal of running 60 kilometres a day for 26 days. I had, $300,000 banked, and the fear of failure was just too great. And there was never a time during that 26 days that I thought about stopping, that I thought about ending it. Even on day 2 or day 14.
Day 14, the shin splints.
Yeah, like that was the most painful thing I've ever experienced. And it's interesting, day 14, I was just running on the road on my own, and by this stage, my body was good. Like I physically was back in good shape and running, good times. And, the last 10 kilometres of each day, like I was running sub 6-minute kilometres, and which is a good pace, let alone at the back end of a 60-kilometre day, and this is where I found myself, and it felt so good to be strong. And then running down a hill, I got this pain in my leg, and those that have had shin splints, and it's really interesting when I tell you this story from stage, and I say I got shin splints, you see there's a real physical reaction from people who have had them, and they go, oh, the pain comes back. Those that haven't had them have no idea what you're talking about. And yeah, day 14 that came, and shin splints, they don't build up. They're not there, then they're there. And the pain is just so intense. And then I was running along the beach, and like the road parallel to the beach, and I was crying, I got tears, I got snot running out of my nose, and I'd worked myself up in this real space, of one through pain. I'd been on the road for 2 weeks, had, well over 700, 800 kilometres already banked, and just wondering what it meant, and got to lunch, and it was a really defining moment at lunch that day, because what the model was that I would run to a support vehicle, and it was a 5-kilometre stage where I could then take on fluid, salt tablets, eat, and change clothes and put sun cream on. So every 5 kilometres I'd run to the vehicle. When they saw me in that condition, they said, "We'll just follow you." And the only thing more painful than running with shin splints is starting. And I stood up to run. I had 18 kilometres to go, and as it turned out, we had to drive back to Bangkok that night, which was between a 3 and 4 hour drive, to be leading this fun run back in Bangkok the next morning. And so I had to get this, this final 18 Ks done. And I stood up and could hardly put weight on my leg, and one of the crew was helping me, and I just started to hobble off, and the pain was just horrible. And knowing that each time you put your foot down, the pain was there. And I just started to run. And with the model that we had, I should have stopped at the 13, the 8 and the 4-kilometre mark. But, I was so scared of if I stopped, I wouldn't be able to start again. So I just kept running. And I had this half-litre water flask in my hand, and I'd drink it. And then Maythil, our monk who was on the bike behind me and had been there from day one to day end, who was riding like 10 metres behind me, I just held out the flask. And because the support vehicle was also behind, and they said, don't worry about these kilometres, you just stop when you want to stop. If you want to stop every 2 kilometres, you just stop and we'll get you through the end of the day. But as I said, I was just so scared of stopping, and I held out this flask. And then as I'd empty it, Maythil rode up on her bike, took the flask, went back to the support vehicle, swapped it over. And so it meant I always had fluid because, like I was running in temperatures that were in the high 30s, and I was drinking between 15 and 20 litres a day. And I was still losing 2.5 to 3 kilos of fluid on top of that. And I'd put it on overnight, but this is just to give you a sense of the conditions and the humidity and just the fluid loss. And so I couldn't run without fluid. And then I got to the 13-kilometre mark, and I just kept running, and because of this fear of stopping, and just kept running and kept swapping the flask. And I got to the 8-kilometre mark, and I kept running, and by that stage, I knew that I'd run all the way that day without stopping. And the interesting thing was, the further I ran, the better I felt, like this feeling, this euphoria within me. And as we started to run along the beach, like the pain was still there, but the reward that we get is commensurate to the struggle and sacrifice. So the reward I had of running along that beach was so great because of the struggle, the sacrifice, and the pain that I was in. And to arrive at the end of the day was the most defining moment of the entire run, not just for me, but for the entire crew. And, we've got that moment captured on video, and it is just so beautiful to watch the reaction of the crew. And the learning that came out of it was, for me, is that leaders bring the weather. Because as leaders, how we turn up matters. Because there were days early on when I would finish that day running and I was empty. Physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, I was empty. There was nothing left of me. And if I arrived at the end of the day and ran in with my head down, the team would respond with their head down, that they would mirror how I felt. If I ran in, regardless of physically how I felt, and I celebrated the end of that day, the team celebrated. And they looked at how I turned up as to how they would respond. And I think it's such a powerful message for those of us that are in business, that are leading, that are influencing, even those of us who just walk into the door with a family at the end of each day. People will look to see how we walk through the door and adjust their emotions and their response accordingly. And so for me, it was such a, there were so many learnings out of this run, and that was a real strong one for me.
It's incredible. And, leaders bring the weather is the message that you bring, but also that we are capable of so much more than we think we are.
Oh, yeah. Like, it was one of the things I talk about is, it was always going to be about what I was willing to do as opposed to what I thought my capabilities were. Because when do we ever know that we're capable of doing big things? It's not until we've done them.
Yeah.
The courage comes after you've done something, because then you know. I never knew, and this was part of the attraction, that this was possible until I finished. And, it was that support of the team. It was that call that, that first morning, 4:30 in the morning, we stood under the lights of the hotel. I got the team in a huddle. I had no idea what I was going to say other than I, deeply appreciated their presence. And it just came to me and I said, together we can. And that became our call. And it went from together we can, and then the team would say, together we will. And then on that final day, on Boxing Day, where we crossed the finish line as a team together and we huddled for the last time, we said, together we did. And none of it would have been possible. And none of the big things we achieve in our life is ever on our own. It's because of those that we have around us.
That message comes through so strongly. I feel emotional as you talk about it, as someone, and all I've done is read this book. But, what struck me was you bring to life the people who are around you during this challenge. And, your team, your crew, as you call them, and you were all driven by this singular purpose. But each of them had their own contribution to that purpose, and the clarity that they seem to have shines through. And I think together we can, together we will, and together we did is such a powerful message. And it's a message, I think, of such hope as well. I want to ask you how, after the intensity of that, how do you come down from this high, this unity of striving to? I can only imagine. When you bring it to life, it's incredible. What you've achieved is phenomenal.
Yeah, it was really interesting going into the run. I was prepared for what I thought I was prepared for post-run, because I'd been on these international deployments where you come home. I was talking to Ant Middleton the other day with him, who's from the UK, the SAS guy, and we're both talking about post-deployment when you return home. And, I'd spent weeks in Thailand carrying the bodies of dead children and, working 18 hours a day without a day off. And you fly home and walk through the shopping centre, and life hasn't changed for anyone else, but life will never be the same for you. And no one understands unless they've been there. No one understands. And, Ant was talking about his deployments, and we were both just saying, you come home and it can be a really, difficult or tricky place to navigate. And because I'd had that experience, I thought post-run, and I was talking with a sports psych, and we both thought that because I had the awareness, we'd talked about it, we were addressing it, I'd experienced it before, that we would be okay with it. And I got to tell you, I couldn't have been more wrong about that. And it was the biggest thing I got wrong. And within 40 hours of finishing the run, I sat on the bed and just questioned what it was all about, and went into this really dark, deep, dark place. And there was no celebration. There was no acknowledgement of what I'd done personally. And, and I came home, and the interesting thing, CT, my wife, who was so integral in the success of this whole thing, we both returned to our farm and we wandered around aimlessly in the days and even week that followed. And we would sit on the balcony of the farm and just in silence. And we just couldn't comprehend what had occurred. And I think the thing that lifted me out of that was that both of us had to go back on the 15th of January. We flew back to Thailand, or we flew back on the 13th, and to lead an 800-kilometre bike ride. And the route of that bike ride for 50 people who were there to celebrate the 20-year anniversary, the route was the exact route I'd run over the last 14, 15 days of my time in Thailand on the run. And so it was, it was in the main, it was this incredible therapy that I was riding these routes, and we were seeing where we'd stopped. And, we stopped at the place where on day 14 I had that shin splint, and And I got to tell you, it wasn't a good place to return to. And CT came up to me at this water stop and said, "How are you?" I said, "Oh, I need to get out of here. Like, it's bad juju in the air here, you know." But riding through, one, I knew the outcome of the run. So I knew that it had been a success, and I was riding at a pace, maybe 3 times what I'd run. So we were traveling through this, and so I think it was that ride, that being surrounded by, 50 people, and I needed to hold the energy for them. So many of them were having this experience, which for them was the biggest thing they'll ever do. And so I had to be aware of that. I had to, support them. And I think it was that gave me that purpose for that couple of weeks. I returned home and, I'd like to say everything was rosy, and it wasn't. It took time. And I think it was, a good 6 months before physically and mentally that I felt good. But as the anniversary of the run rolled around, CT said to me, at the beginning of December, I'm really grieving what we had. And this month, that's what it's been like. But yeah, I think it was just something that, as I said, we thought we were prepared, but we were not.
Mm. The message of your book, Together We Can, it feels so relevant today, as you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, 2 days after that horrific Bondi attack. And given your life experiences, I wonder if you could share your thoughts on how can we respond, like, as individuals and as communities, how can we respond to this?
Yeah, like it's, there's a number of things, and we're seeing some of them already, where there'll be the grief, there'll be the anger, there'll be the blame, and and it's easy to point fingers and say, "Oh, the police should have done this, ASIO should have done that," and there was an interview that Malcolm Turnbull gave yesterday, and I thought it was so appropriate and prudent, where he talked about the difficulty in preventing a sole actor, or father and son in this case, from carrying out this. Like the more people that are involved in a movement or something, well, then the more chance there is to be aware of that and pick up on, the talk and as they talk as a community, you can be more aware of that through an intelligence gathering point of view. But when it's the actions of just one person, and then, father, son here, it's so hard. It's so hard for the police agencies and those involved in that to be able to prevent that. And I think, take away, and I don't take away, but the whole sadness and the loss and the impact upon the families, the Jewish community, that loss of innocence that exists, I think then the loss is compounded when we start to blame other people. And and I spent 20 years in that area. I worked for Interpol. I worked for the UN on counterterrorism, and I'd like to think I've got an awareness of what goes in to try and prevent things, and it's just so difficult. And I think it's what we need, and it might sound like a cliche, but it's to come together, and it's to find how we move forward. And what do we do now? We can't change what's happened, but we can change what happens next. And, and that will be part of inquiries. It'll be part of the coronial inquiry. It'll be, there'll be legislative change around firearms and so forth. But, laws alone don't prevent this. And, we see gangland wars occurring through Sydney, where people are shooting each other and involved in those criminal networks. And, the laws don't stop that. It's people who have that intent and that desire, sadly, will find a way to bring about that type of harm and loss and destruction and fear. And that's what terrorism is. It's fear that's created. And the Jewish community has sat with that for years. And so, there's got to be an acceptance of what we can change. And I think it's how we respond that matters most now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Peter, it's been an absolute honour to interview you.
Thank you.
I've taken you over time. I'm sorry. Your book, I'm going to put in the show notes. It's available in different formats. We'll put links in the show notes. The video you talk about, we'll link to that as well. That was at day 14.
It was,
coming
yeah.
in. We'll link to that to our listeners. Please, please buy the book. You will not regret it. It has such a powerful message. I'd love you to close the show with any final words you have, and also, if you wouldn't mind just answering this final question as well, is if you could realize your dream, your vision over the next 5 years for hands across the water and, the commercial entities that you're creating, the impact, the growth, the legacy, what might that look like?
Yeah, I think that vision for 5 years, and I outlined that in October at our gala dinner, and we've got a lot of work on that right now. We've had feasibility reports written. We're engaging with different partners, and nothing moves quickly in Thailand. So that's my frustration is that. But what it will allow us to do is ensure continuity, because there's a huge reliance upon me within the charity for distribution. And we need to, from a business point of view, remove the dependence and reliance upon me in case I choose to do something different or that choice is taken away from me. And, we need to raise $2 million a year to meet the recurrent operating costs and the health costs, the education costs, the uni costs, the staff costs in Thailand. And the best thing we can do is create certainty around that. And that's what the sustainable projects and the 5-year vision will do, is meet those operating costs through these commercial activities. And then it will allow us with the money that comes in through the charity, through the bike rides, just to bring about more change for a broader community.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the For Love and Money podcast. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the purpose movement, visit us at thecauseeffect.com.au. And remember, doing good is good for business. So if you're not doing good, then what are you doing?